Welcome to our undergraduate honors colloquium. It is wonderful to have you here to celebrate and learn from the two students who are presenting today. So we will have a talk first by Lindsay Hatch and then by Sarah Ertl. So Lindsay will start us off. She will present implosives cross-linguistically. We will hear from her for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. Lindsay. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Oh, wait, I have this. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lindsay Hatch, and I wrote my undergraduate thesis on implosives cross-linguistically.
Is this going to click on the top screen? Yeah, just click anywhere there. And then
Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to dive right in. What is an implosive? So implosives canonically are known as glottalic ingressives. Now, this means that there is a closure somewhere at the glottis and then somewhere in the oral tract. And when the larynx is lowered, this decreases the air pressure within the oral tract. And when that closure is released, this creates ingressive airflow, which means in and not out. They're found in about 13% of world's languages, somewhere around there. Some studies say varying numbers, but somewhere around there. And then there's two typological hotspots in Southeast Asia and West Africa. So within my research, I have found that the canonical implosive that you are presented with in a phonetics class is not necessarily what you hear in certain languages. So this is a clip from the word drum in Achan, which is the language I work on, Agbi. And the word three in Vietnamese. Ba, ba. So as you probably can tell, those sound pretty different. And many linguists, especially Africanists, have pointed this out. And they found that these sounds tend to have varying productions depending on the language and depending on the area. They can be produced with no ingressive airstream and without rarefaction. They can be produced with modal voicing. Larynx lowering does occur, but it's not necessarily unique to that of implosives. It can be produced with full glottal closure or without, and some have been reported to lack voicing. So these observations suggest that the defining feature of an implosive may be something outside of the ideas that we have of the canonical version. And no single characteristic across these languages is a uniting factor. So how can we say that they're all the same sound? So same goes for phonology. A typological study done by Sandy and Oakley looks at a sample of 95 languages, and it found that typologically, or a third of languages pattern with sonorants, meaning that it depends on the language what this could mean, but this could have something to do with nasalization or being found in the coda position. With obstruents in a third of languages, meaning it patterns the rest of the consonants within the language, or the rest of the stops, and then have some sort of mixed patterning. And this can mean a lot of different things, again, depending on the language. So my questions for this paper are, number one, how do implosives vary cross-linguistically and what unites them? And number two, what are the acoustic differences between an implosive and their non-imploded counterpart within a language? And also, do these differences account for the differences in the phonological patternings that we see? So I looked at 5 different languages, Achan, Ingula, which are both spoken here in Cote d'Ivoire, and then Lobi, which is spoken in northern Cote d'Ivoire and southern Burkina Faso. I looked at Sindhi, which is spoken in Pakistan and parts of India, and then Vietnamese, which in Vietnam. So I also looked at 5 different measurements. So I looked at duration, intensity, mean and peak, intensity, slope, and then more descriptively, I looked at formant transitions and formant structure. All of this data was collected either in the field this past summer, doing fieldwork in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, with speakers of Achan and Ingula, and with speakers in the Bay Area of Sindhi, Lobi, and Vietnamese in the Berkeley Phonetics Lab. So I'm going to run through these languages really quickly. Hopefully it's not too fast. But Achan has 2 implosives, B and D. All of them pattern as sonorants, meaning that they have nasal allophones. So B has a nasal allophone of M. M is always underlyingly B. And then D is an allophone of L. and this appears after before high vowels. And basically these, L also has a nasal allophone of N, which is the same as D. But yeah, Ingala has 5 implosives, the bilabial, alveolar, palatal, velar, and labiovelar. I do not cover labiovelars because in this paper they are pretty, in the language they are pretty rare, but all of them, except for some bilabials, which I will talk about in a minute, pattern like obstruents because they come from historical voiceless unaspirates. So T became implosive D and so on. Now the bilabial inventory gets a little tricky. We can see that it went from 4-way contrast to a 2-way contrast, meaning that there is a implosive B that comes from P, like the rest of the implosives in the inventory, and a implosive B that comes from proto-implosive B. There's also a marginal phoneme of like regular B that comes from loanwords, which I do look at in the paper, but it's not from proto-Potu. And Achan and Ingala make up the Potu part of the Potu-Tanu family or branch of the Kwa family, so they are related. Ingala, because of these 2 different historical sources, you see some differences in the phonological patternings. So Ingala has a nasalization process where nasal subjects cause nasalization on the verbs that begin with sonorants. So when you have implosive B, that's from proto-implosive B, it nasalizes, while the implosive that's from proto-P does not. So that's how you get these minimal pairs like abo and mbo, you break and I break, where you have nasalization, but then you have you love and I love, abo and mbo, where you don't. So this is kind of an interesting way to look at it, where it is kind of an interesting part of the mixed patterning group. But our big question is, like, are these phonetically neutralized? And I will talk about that a little bit, but Lobi has 1 implosive. It has a mixed patterning. It's meaning that it's found in codas, like the sonorants, and also in consonant clusters, like as the first sound in a consonant cluster, like obstruents within the language. Sindhi has 4 implosives. They all pattern like obstruents. Word medial implosives historically come from geminates, and people claimed a lot of things about the word initial ones, but they definitely don't come from voiceless stops. They definitely come from some type of voice stop. Vietnamese has 2 implosives. They all pattern like obstruents, and interestingly, Vietnamese does not have non-imploded counterparts. So in theory, you would assume that there would be a lot of variation in production because they don't have another sound that they have to compete with within that acoustic space. So going into results. Here are results across languages. So this is duration. So if we're looking here, we can see that there's a ton of variation. Achan and Ingala, the implosive Bs are higher, are longer, while in like Lobi and Vietnamese, they're much shorter. But so it's important to like look at this, but it's like clearly not a uniting factor across languages. Instead, looking at intensity across the production of the implosive, we can see that there are some similarities. Across the board, the implosive B is higher intensity, but there are some differences. So we can see in languages like Sindhi and Vietnamese and even Lobi that there is this like sloping trajectory versus languages like Achan and Ingala, where you have a much flatter trajectory. It starts pretty high and ends like around the same measurement throughout the entire thing. And this kind of maps onto what we see in the waveforms, obviously. But as you can see in like the word pen in Vietnamese, you have this really pretty and like perfect like gradual increase in amplitude, which is what you would expect like from an implosive. In a phonetics 101 class, this is what they show of like implosives look like this. But if you look at Acha, you can see that it kind of goes from 0 to 100 and then it just stays pretty level throughout the rest of the production. You don't have that same gradual difference. Looking also at the alveolars, you can see that the implosive D has a similar trajectory where it's pretty flat compared to that of non-imploded D and non-imploded B. With Ingala, these are the ones that come from the voiceless unaspirates. So these do kind of look more sloping and more obstruent-like, which is what we would expect, but also they are just notably higher in intensity across the board. Looking at the bilabials, so this work comes from work that Alexandra Pfiffner and I have done in the past year or so. We spoke at the LSA about this, but we do kind of see that the implosives from their they kind of patterns what you would expect from their historical origins. So you have P, bilabial implosive from P being lower in intensity than that of B, and it also is shorter in duration than the one from implosive B, which makes sense for they're holding on to their historical origins. Looking at low B, we see more sloping than like languages like Achan and Ingala, but we still see it being higher in intensity. Sindhi, same thing here. They are higher in intensity and much more of a sloping trajectory than Achan and Ingala. Now, this is the palatal, and then that's the velar. We do see some interesting things going on with the velar where it starts lower and ends higher. I have some ideas as to why this could be. Gay, 1968, talks about how like diphthongs change depending on their duration, and G's across the board are a lot shorter than the rest of these sounds. So maybe if a slope is more important, maybe it starts lower, ends higher. Not super like locked in on that explanation, but that could be. And then Vietnamese. Now this is wild compared to like looking at Achan and Ingala. There's almost like a 40 decibel difference between the start and the end of the implosive. So what we have seen is a ton of variation across languages. And while duration doesn't seem to be a super important uniting factor, intensity does seem to be that. We see them being higher across the board in all languages than their non-imploded counterparts. But we do see some differences, being that languages like Achan have a very flat implosive trajectory. They start high and they kind of maintain that, versus Vietnamese, which starts low and ends high. And this seems to reflect this idea of an implosive continuum, which is something that Ladefoged and Clements and Osu have talked about, where on one side you have something that's like a true implosive with suction and rarefaction, and then something on the other side that's like slightly more sonorous. So going back to the questions that I asked, how do implosives vary cross-linguistically and what unites them? They vary a lot. And what unites them, what are like the acoustic differences between an implosive and a non-imploded counterpart? The intensity is higher. This is kind of what I've just been able to find. And I looked at multiple other things within my paper. Like I said, like formant transitions and formant structure that I didn't talk about here, but intensity seems to be like the most standout of all of the measurements that I looked at. And then do they account for differences in the phonological patterns that we see? And in most cases, yes, they do. If we kind of like map this out, where on one side here we have like a sonorant kind of implosive that has a higher and flatter intensity, more vowel-like, more approximate-like. And on the other side, we have an obstruent that's more sloping intensity, more consonant stop-like. We can see that like it maps out pretty well. We have like Achan on this side, we have Vietnamese and Sindhi on that side, and then we have low B kind of somewhere in the middle, which again, it has like a mixed patterning. Where should Ingala go? I still have a lot to look at with that. It's just a very complicated situation. This could have to do with its historical origins, and it holding on to some phonological patternings that affect its, even now though the phonetics are different. But for most of the languages that we see, this kind of maps out nicely. Future directions. I would love to get more airflow data. Alexandra and I last summer got a lot of airflow data from Achan and Ingala speakers, and we're working on it, and it looks really great. I would love to look at more languages. Some dialects of U.S. English even have implosives. Like, there are so many languages that people don't talk about that have implosives, and I would love to look at that. I would love to look at differences in production. So, like, what about the production of these sounds is causing these acoustic cues that we see, as well as, like, obviously looking at more potential acoustic differences. Some people have talked about the differences in larynx lowering. Maybe some are lower than others, or there's different ways of increasing oral cavity that create different levels of implosion and things of that nature. I would also love to look at labiovelars. I didn't talk about labiovelar implosive in Inglaw, but I would really like to. There's a lot of discussion over whether canonically labiovelars are imploded or not. And I have a lot to say about this, so if you want to keep talking about that, we can talk later. But I'd also love to look at how different historical sources kind of change what the implosives look like, not only in their production, but also in their, like, phonological patternings. So, conclusions. Just to sum everything up, based on this subset of languages that have implosives, phonetic correlates seem to kind of back up the differences in their phonological patternings, which is really cool. Phonetics and phonology can be friends. And overall, implosives are different. And it's important for linguists to talk about these different sounds that they find when describing them. So these are my references, and thank you. Okay, yeah, 5 minutes for questions. Okay, yeah, I'll keep an eye out. Oh, yes, it's time for questions, everyone. And if you have a question on Zoom, yes, Larry has a question. I will get to you. Okay. Yes, Keith.
Thanks, Lindsay. This is really wonderful work.
Thank you.
There was one aspect of the methods that I just wondered what the figures mean, because you have the time courses that you relied on quite a lot, and I'm assuming that those were time normalized from the beginning to the end of something you kind of structures.
Yeah, it was taken at, like, intervals within the, yeah.
And the other thing was, like, what the starting point was and what the ending point was for the trajectories. Like, what were the landmarks that let you know?
Yeah, I kind of started for word initial ones. I started when I saw like the start of voicing, and then I ended at the burst. So and for word medial, I kind of tried to see where, usually in the word medial ones, it was after a vowel. So I kind of tried to see where that vowel ended, and then ended it at the burst, as well as, and then one of the Lobi has word final implosives, and I did take those out of the duration measurements just because they look different. But yeah. Katie has a question. Oh yeah. Oh wait, Larry. I can take your question.
Okay. Hi. This was great. I really enjoyed it and learned from it. I wonder if you looked at F0 effects of implosives.
Okay, so
for it to vary, and I wonder if it would correlate with your other findings.
I did not look at F0. That is only something that Alexandra and I have looked at previously, and it in just the Inglaw stuff, and we didn't find a ton. But that would be something interesting to look at. There have been papers that claim, like, different things about F0 being a Q, and then in one language it's not a Q. So it's, it's hard to say, but that is definitely something that I would love to look at. Thank you.
So nice to see all of this work together, and I think you've done a lot of work together, so props to you.
Thank you.
But I also think it's, like, super, super important for anyone who does description of any language that might have an impulsive. I think it's this is a great reminder to be very precise when describing them. So I have a lot of big questions, and I've talked to you about some of these before, but no need to have specific answers right now. But I wanted to bring up two things. So one, I'm curious whether you think that it's even valid to call these all the same sounds. Like, why are we calling them all implicit? That's just kind of a remnant of these different people describing them using the same word in English, but we're like not all referring to the same thing. And then second, I'm curious if you think that there's any particular phonetic form that you can point to for the teacher complementary phonemes. And maybe intensity is kind of getting there from your plot at the very end, but I mean, we like to think of the teacher as being associated with like phonetic forms.
Yeah.
Ideally, it's with or ambulatory. And so kind of with that mixed patterning as opposed to inferiority.
Okay, number one, I feel like I'm not qualified enough to say, maybe when I get my PhD, then I will claim that they're not the same sound, or maybe I will. But I mean, people have hinted at this before, like in the Clements and Osu paper, they do talk about like, oh, this is not an implosive, it's an unexploded bilabial. And it's like, okay, sure. But like, if there is like a continuum, right, like where do you draw the line? So that, I mean, that is, so come back to me in like 6 or 7 years, and then maybe I'll make a claim. And then number 2 was, what feature? Yeah, I mean, probably something. I mean, from this study, probably something like having to do with intensity or change in intensity, like some feature that could like encompass that. I'm not really sure what that would look like, but I mean, hopefully, right, like once I get some airflow data and stuff from these other languages, maybe that would be more illuminating. So I'm hoping to like, I'm trying to do that too. So yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh.
I was wondering more about your simile. Were they similar in form and number across the languages? And what about Canada? I know you just said you were looking at external, but I'm curious.
Okay, so I had a ton of data from Achaningua, just because like I did fieldwork there and like I work on those languages, but I only met with one speaker of each of the other languages, so I didn't have as much data, especially for Cindy. He was only able to come into the lab once, so I would love to get more of that, but yeah. Wait, what was the rest of your question?
Like, did they have the same form? Or did you actually have the?
Oh yeah, it was all elicitation. So I just had like, for the Achan Ingula stuff, me and Alexandra kind of came up with word lists that like found things in different places within the word and whatnot. But also with the languages of the speakers that with the languages that I don't work with, I used like a lot of like word lists from papers, like the one that you did, and then some other stuff from like JPA articles or other papers on the implosives of the languages. Yeah. Any last takers?
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.